Now in this video, we can look at the error you might encounter in the process of creating a wall type family. So we open up the new project file based on a standard architectural template, and we scroll down on the project browser down to the wall section of the family, and we're going to click on a generic 150 and use that as a base for starting to create these additional new wall type that we may need in our project. Now we're going to double click on the generic 150 wall type, and then it's going to open up the type property dialog box, and we're going to click on the edit button here next to structure on the first item here to open up the edit assembly dialog box, and then we can add additional components inside these wall type assembly. Now once you open up the edit assembly dialog box, you're going to see a number of columns in here: function, material, and thickness. Now the function is going to determine what type of component you're going to be put inside this wall assembly: the structure, substrate, thermal air layer, finish 1, finish 2, and membrane layer. And then the other material, you can actually go in here and open up the material browser and assign material to this layer of material inside this wall style. And the thickness, so you can enter a thickness from 0 to whatever value that is appropriate for the wall style. Now one thing you should be aware of, although you can enter 0 thickness in the wall component, but the component must be equal to membrane layer if it's going to be a 0 thickness. Otherwise it doesn't make sense, you know. All material is going to have a thickness. Even membrane layer in reality has a thickness, but for practical purpose, for the exercise of creating a wall style, you can have it as 0. Okay. The other thing is you cannot have a membrane layer with 0 thickness and not any other components with 0 thickness, because that way the total wall thickness will be 0, and REVIT will not let you create a wall style that has a 0 thickness. So you must have another component that is not 0 inside the wall style if you're going to have one of the layer to be 0 thickness. So for example, if I turn this to be 0, and it's going to give me a layer if I select OK. So only layer with function set to membrane layer may have 0. Now if I change this to, it won't even let me change this to the membrane layer, because it's going to read the value of the column before it actually allow me to change the function. So if I change this back to say 150 as it was before, and change this to membrane layer, and then change this to 0, it's still going to give me an error, because the error will be there must be at least one layer with non-0 thickness. So you have to be mindful about these information. So we're going to change this back to 150 for the stud layer, and we're going to change it back to structure. And then we can actually insert another layer in here, and we're going to change this. Now if we're going to leave it as structure, it's going to give us the same error, because you cannot have a 0 thickness for structural layer. But if we change this to membrane layer and select OK, then it will allow you to save. So that's the first error you might encounter, which is 0 thickness when you're creating wall style. Now the second error you might encounter during creating a new wall type family, is arrangement of the different wall layer components. So we have a membrane layer and a structural layer. And now if we create a couple additional layers, say for another layer, this is going to be structure 1, and we're going to move it up out of the core boundary. We can move the membrane layer up out of the core boundary, and now we're going to change the structure layer into a finish layer. Okay, so a finish, and we're going to make these finish to be, let's say this is a 20mm finish, so it's not going to have a 0 thickness value when it's not a membrane layer. And then we're going to insert another one, and this is going to be structure, and we can keep the structural layer maybe about say 10mm. Now if we select OK, it's going to give us an error, because you cannot have a structure on top of a finish. But if we actually switch it around, finish 1, move it up, and we select OK, then it will allow you to save. And again, if we switch it back down, if we go push the finish back down and change the structure layer to be substrate, and again it's going to give you an error, because you cannot have these kind of non-finished layer on top of the finished layer. So we select OK, it's going to give you an error. So you have to be mindful that the finished layer always have to be at the furthest top layer, which is exterior side or on the interior side, and not, you cannot have a finish layer behind a substrate or a structural layer. So these are the second error you might encounter while you're creating these new additional wall type family. Now let's take a look what happens when you add additional layer on the inside face of these core boundaries. So I'm going to add 2 layers inside here. I'm going to move it down. Now if I make this into a finish layer and assign this maybe 13mm for drywall, and this is going to be fine. If I select OK, it's going to allow me to say, oh, I forgot that structural layer cannot be 0. So what happens if I change this to membrane layer? It's going to be fine. But if I change this to be substrate and make these into like maybe about 20mm again, and I move these on the inside, on the interior face, so it is covering up the finish. If I select OK, it's going to give me an error because you cannot have a substrate component on the outside face of the finish. So these are the design rule that REVIT has built in to prevent you from creating these silly mistakes. So what we need to do is click on the finish one and then move it down. Then if you select OK, then the REVIT will allow you to save these as wall style without error. So these are the general information you should keep in the back of your mind when you're creating wall style, so that if you come across these errors, you know how to deal with them. So I hope you find this video helpful, and thank you for watching.